Welcome to the Being Human UT podcast, where Dr. Randy Jasmine and Dr. Jim Hindigas will discuss issues relative to the humanities and technology at Utah Tech University. And now your hosts for Being Human UT podcast, Dr. Randy Jasmine and Dr. Jim Hindigas.
Hello and welcome to the Being Human UT podcast. I'm Randy Jasmine, joined as always with my co-host Jim Hindigas, and we've got a special guest here today, a guest who over the years I've known in two different capacities. Currently, he is a colleague in the English department as a graduate instructor, but he was also an undergraduate student of mine and wrote papers about Octavia Butler's Kindred and Edith Wharton's House of Mirth. But Brett, you've done a lot of other things in your academic career. Tell us a little bit about those.
Yeah, so I graduated from Utah Tech in 2017, and I went on to get a master's degree in arts administration from Southern Utah University. I started working with arts nonprofits after I got my degree in English. I started working with the Harry Bertoia Foundation, and I started working on digital remediation projects. So with the Harry Bertoia Foundation, I worked on their digital catalog Resonate, and I entered monotypes by the artist Harry Bertoia into the catalog so that they could be accessed and viewed digitally online. And so that got me interested in arts administration and kind of running my own arts nonprofit. So I went on to SUU and got a master's degree, and it was during the pandemic. So I was able to get a graduate assistantship at the art museum on campus there at SUMA. And I also continued kind of my remediation work there, working on a project. I was digitizing some early works by the artist Jimmy Jones, and also this bizarre, enigmatic painter, Julius Musil, who immigrated here from Germany in Chicago. He lived in Chicago for the 30s and 40s, and he was a really disturbing character. But I digitized all his works, and then I also curated some exhibitions while I was there. So that's what the remediation work is, what got me interested in kind of digital rhetoric and wanting to come back to Utah Tech and become a graduate student in the technical writing and digital rhetoric program, and then become a graduate instructor to try teaching. So
that's great. And I know Jim's going to kick us off here with the first question, but as I was preparing for this podcast, I thought, this is really good because this is going to be the first episode where we're really going to be kind of focusing on image and have it really be image-heavy technology. A lot of the technology we've talked about has been new to us, but it certainly is in the realm of text and writing and the kinds of things that we as English instructors and, in the past as English students are familiar with. And the image is really something that's significant. You attended our conference last fall with Marianne Wolf, and she talked about how that's where we're headed.
Absolutely.
We're headed into a visual culture and not a written culture, not a text culture.
Yes. So
some of the things that you think about and some of the people that you look at raise ideas that we need to be thinking about for sure.
I agree. Yeah. And just to note already, I've noticed with my students, they're great at doing visual analysis, but it's far more difficult to do textual analysis. And it's because, they're just constantly consuming visuals on digital platforms today. So focusing on what I do in my classroom is bring in these visual rhetoricians and these other scholars who put image and symbolic representations at the core of their research to try to give students skills to kind of help process all the visual information that they consume and also respond to it in a critical way. So, yeah, I agree that I think we're headed more towards a visually centered culture, which has both positives and negatives. So,
for sure,
yeah.
Well, and along with that, okay, so you're doing all this digitization of previous material or what was created before this sort of very digital world, the 21st century that we're at. There's so much, and then there's added content that's happening now. There's a wealth of information that's happening. I don't know what we want to call it all, whether the generalized text or information, or there's just so much that we're subjected to. And as a graduate student, I mean, I feel like I was in this sort of straddling phase where it was digitized when I was working on my graduate degree, but I also had plenty of time in the library where I could just get a stack of books and have a very focused research experience. How does the 21st century graduate student really whittle down all that information? Because there's so much, so much access, so much information. How do you focus?
Yeah, it is complicated. I think it's both thrilling and challenging, the levels of access. But I will say that I think the internet used to be far more open than it is today. So we characterize it as this very open space. But for me, access is an issue because there are so many paywalls now that we experience. And that includes not just access to great journals, but also technologies that I may be wanting to use or write about or research. When we think about the cost of academic databases, right, which we unfortunately have are going to lose some access to those databases because of funding cuts. And so we view the internet as being this very open space, but I think it's kind of a mirage of access. And so having to navigate the levels of access, being a graduate student at this university and being able to access all these academic databases with all of these great articles I can find on, viewing art through augmented reality, for example. I don't have access to that when I'm not, a graduate student. So paywalls, just kind of the ability to self-publish as well is also an issue. The amount of information that people can put online, having to assess if it really is worthy of my time or I should include it in my scholarship or something like that. And another issue in terms of staying focused really is the fluidity of the digital age, because things are changing so quickly, So to give you an example, in my user-centered design class this semester, I was assigned to create a research study on the Meta Ray-Ban glasses. And these are glasses where there's a camera in the frame, and so you can live stream visual content from a point of view position. And I got these glasses. Dr. McMurrin, she had a pair and she let me borrow them. And within this, 3-month period where I was conducting or creating this research study, and I was doing all of this research to find scholarship to back up kind of some ideas that I had about recommendations or changes, Meta came out with a new version of the glasses. They had the specific pain points that I thought might be issues for content curators when they use the glasses. On Meta's Instagram page, they were already creating content that was specifically about what I was researching and writing about. So my research became obsolete, within a few within such a short time frame. So having to deal with how quickly things move in the digital age, how difficult that can be as a scholar. Another example is my thesis project is I'm bringing augmented reality into the composition classroom. So I'm doing research on if augmented reality, viewing artworks through augmented reality can be a tool to help teach students critical visual analysis, and if that will aid in their writing process. And I'm using the Google Arts and Culture app because it's a great platform where all these museums have provided scans of pieces from their permanent collection. So you can view all of these artworks in augmented reality, but within the year that I've been working on this project, the interface has changed many times. The accessibility of augmented reality on the app has changed. And so I'm very aware that I could wake up tomorrow and my ability to access this central tool that I'm doing research on may not be there, for whatever reason, whether it's because Google has data that says, this is not really a tool that is worthy of our time or people are using or something like that. So nothing feels stable, which is, I don't really have any strategies for how to deal with that yet, but it's just kind of being aware that projects will evolve and move rather quickly because information moves so quickly in the digital age.
Not to give you a completely esoteric follow-up question on that, but as you were talking, access is something that, we think about, and, we were talking before the podcast about, Jonathan Berger and his series, Ways of Seeing, and you've talked about even sharing the first part with your students. Mm-hmm. Part of what he talks about in that first episode is this idea that when you take the image out of the context, you see the painting on your computer screen as opposed to seeing it in the cathedral where it's, placed.
Right.
It changes that, and it changes what it means and the significance of it.
Right.
How does that then connect with this idea that now all of a sudden we like you say, it's the belief that we have, everything is free, everything is open, everything is accessible, unless the powers that be decide
not to.
We don't want to let that be accessible. So does that in any way interfere with some of your ideas about assignments for students and tasks for students? Or do you just say, well, I'm going to use those images that I can see there that are accessible?
I mean, it does impact in ways perhaps I didn't really expect, which is that I think that the paintings that are available for me to view are great works of art, but my students may not, you know. So, and certainly, some of the greatest museums have shared works from their permanent collections on this platform, which is, as, Berger would point out, I mean, this is the greatest level of access to art ever, in my opinion. But it's still a fraction, because there's power in limiting that access. So I do have to provide a lot of scaffolding and explaining to my students that this is a great opportunity, even if you don't necessarily get to see anything that you find particularly inspiring, right? But also, the reason why I think focusing on viewing art through augmented reality, Berger points out in Ways of Seeing that when you view a painting, there is a stillness, there's a quiet. And that's what's so special and unique about this exchange of discourse that happens, because you may be looking at something extreme or wild or violent in terms of its content, but it's silent, it's still, and it encourages this kind of reflection. And that's how it communicates with you. And augmented reality retains that in a way that I don't think viewing it statically on a screen does. So, for example, when we think of like the Eisenheim altarpiece by Grunewald, if I'm saying that name correctly, but that was a piece that really influenced Picasso, influenced a lot of modern art. And you may not be able to view that in its original setting, which is in this church. But still, using augmented reality, it still appears in front of you as though it were actually in front of you, because it appears in scale. So it retains a sense of its power, which is exciting in terms of access, right? Because we can't go to this church in Germany, but we can be on the lawn of Utah Tech University and provide students a similar experience, a similar level of access to this visual. But certainly I do think it is complicated to provide students with, do I provide them with only a certain number of paintings that they can view or something like that when I'm developing assignments or things? How do I want to help them recognize the broad amount of visual content that they can view, but at the same time, I have to provide kind of a limited experience based on access. If that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, and it kind of connects to something else I was thinking about that you presented on back in the fall, and that is the sequencing that you talked about in your presentation on the endless stream of images that you kind of create this scenario in which that stillness that Berger talks about can be achieved, in which maybe the intent can't be completely replicated, but can be to some extent. What happens though, out in the world outside the classroom,
right,
when you have this constant stream of images, and some of them, as you pointed out, horrific, and yet to many people's minds, that's just the next image in a never-ending series that doesn't maybe hold any more or less relevance than the one that came before.
Right. To me, it is about providing students, and I developed this this digital curation project where I try to get students to recognize how the scroll modifies the content that they see, and how we can become, it neuters the message, and so we can become, we stop caring about what we see, right? And that is because within this infinite scroll of information, you can see, as I have witnessed myself, some really violent content from, if we think of the October 7th attack in Israel, or some violent content from the front lines of the war in Ukraine, but then the next video is a cat video, or the next image is an advertisement to buy shoes or something. And so I'm, and Marianne Wolf pointed this out in her lecture for the conference, the Reading and Learning in the Digital Age conference. She said, these platforms don't design a space for us to engage with content critically or really develop any kind of cognitive patience to help us process or understand what we're seeing. And that's intentional, So because when it's just a scroll of information and the thing that we focus on is the advertisement for the shoes, maybe we'll be more willing to buy. Or if we just become addicted, then, that helps with their ad revenue, because the longer we're on it, then the more advertisements that can appear kind of within the stream. So the goal is to provide students with that framework for critical analysis, because it is something we have to insert ourselves, right? We have to train ourselves to change the way that we view visual content, because the way that we are currently consuming it and being conditioned to consume it is within this continuous scroll. And as I mentioned in my presentation at that conference, one of the main scholars who influenced that work, his name is Nathan Crick. And he has a great chapter in this book called Ancient Rhetorics and Digital Networks. And he highlights this image that went viral of this young boy who he was a migrant from Syria, and he was in a boat with his family going to Europe, and the boat sank. And so he drowned, and his body washed up on a shore in Turkey. And a journalist took a photo of it, and it went viral on social media. And so he highlights this image and this moment because even though he himself was impacted, and it made him think for a minute about what was happening, why did this boy have to drown? What was the specific scenario that led up to this? What can change? No change came of it, because It was just in this scroll of information. So a few days later, everyone had processed so much visual information that, what happened 3 days ago? I don't remember. So what he talks about is how that image, although it went viral and millions of people commented and shared it, it didn't lead to any kind of legislation. There was no rhetorical action. There was no change within our society. And so he says that it is the rhetorical challenge of our century, developing a way that we can actually process all of the visual content that we're seeing, because we are not being provided opportunities to do that.
Yeah, just one last thing, and I'll let Jim ask his next question. I apologize for dominating the question section.
You better apologize.
It just made me think of these people that I work with, and whose work not who I work with directly, but whose work I use. It sounds like Crick is pointing out that this image didn't have the effect of, say, Jacob Riis's 1890 pictures of the slums of New York City.
Yes, absolutely.
Which was had such a profound impact. And when I teach How the Other Half Lives, I talked how it wasn't the words on the page primarily that motivated people to action in New York City. It was the images. And yes, many of them were staged. There's no question about that. But people had that very immediate reaction. And you saw, the Mulberry Street ghetto get cleaned up and parks being made in some of these places. The infamous 5 Points area being kind of changed because of the result of Riis's work. And with this, the reaction is very different.
Right. And I think it's because you can't live with the content in the same way. When we think about those photographs that were, may have been published in a newspaper, the access to it is different in that you can repeatedly view it. There is within the ways that people can consume that kind of content, there is that kind of processing that can take place. And so I remember in your class as an undergrad, looking at those photographs and thinking there's one of, which I think was staged, but it's a child who is starving and he's being held by his friends. And I remember making a connection to kind of a Pietà or something. It has this dramatic imagery and this kind of religious connotation to the photograph. And because we were in a classroom, I was provided that opportunity to engage with it in that way. But I also think if I had received it in a newspaper and I was able to kind of live with that image and think about it, it would have more of an impact on me. Whereas, to relate to this kind of mirage of access that I mentioned, that's how everything is in the digital age, And so we're not able to live with it in the same way that we were before, which hinders our ability to, I think, process and move into some kind of symbolic action that would bring about change, such as, cleaning up the ghetto or something like that.
One of the questions I wanted to ask you was just this idea of not only of access, not only of monetization, and then there's a tremendous amount of mistrust. It's there's this idea that, well, is that a fake? And I mean, I don't know, in the art world, I'm not as familiar with it, but I mean, I know there's the concept of having either a fake or a replication that wasn't authentic. But online, I mean, digitization, I mean, you can put anything into any image with Photoshop. And so, how does that factor in to the equation as well? That on two, probably more levels than this, but on the level of authenticity, but then on the level of trustworthiness, so much of early composition courses are focused on identifying credible sources. And then you have, that's much more expanded now with a lot more digital information.
I agree. I think I was mentioning to Randy before the podcast started, but as a concerned U.S. citizen, I'm worried about the upcoming presidential election and how all of these tools that are now available for people to create really credible looking content. In my multimodal production class, I had to use AI generated voices, and, I paid $29 and I got, Mary Louise Kelly from NPR an AI version of her voice to narrate my instructional videos, and I was really impressed with the quality. So, now there are all these tools where people can make a video where it appears Joe Biden is giving a speech that, he never gave or anything like that. So it is becoming far more difficult to discern credibility. And that's really where I think I have my students, I watch France 24, which is this French, this public French news station in English. And they have this great program called Truth or Fake. And every week, these journalists go over viral content, and if, they discern if it's truth or fake. And they, have a formula. Who's the source? Where does it come from? Can you kind of Google the image and see if there are similar images that appear that are unrelated to the context that this source may say, this is from the front lines of Ukraine, but then when you Google a screenshot of the video, it's actually, from a movie or something like that. So I in my English 1010, I made my students watch some of those videos, and then they had to trace the information to the source and evaluate if it was credible or not. And that really just is kind of critical analysis and going with your gut, but also I think, and this is probably the arts advocate in me, arts administration is all about running nonprofits, so donating to good sources, but supporting NPR, supporting these trustworthy sources that have standards, and that, when we think of recently the Kate Middleton photo, she released a photograph that she used Photoshop to manipulate. And Reuters, AP, they pulled the photo because they could tell it was manipulated, so they weren't going to run it. Supporting those sources that have those standards, I think, is really the only way to kind of help with the misinformation. But it is very worrying and concerning. And my hope is that by providing better visual analysis skills, perhaps people will be able to recognize what the content is, where it's coming from, and if it's credible or not. But yes, we're in for a interesting time.
Well, yeah, and I think the thing that worries me the most is that sometimes you also in cycles like this, you have to start with, you have to care.
Right.
I think that the most troubling aspect is when you hear somebody that says, well, I don't like this person anyway, so I don't care if this source is credible or not. It reinforces a view that I already have. Yes. And so I always start with my students. So you should care if this is real or not. You should care if this person actually said this or actually did this. And then go from there so that you have a more realistic representation. Instead of going, I know you're a monster and I'm going to find proof, because you'll find proof of anyone being a monster.
Yeah, that's an excellent. You can find anything that kind of reinforces your biases, and there's not going to be. And that really, to me, and that's what I discussed with my students in showing them Berger. Berger is about there's a difference between looking and seeing. Seeing, we are culturally shaped in how we see things, and we need to unpack that. And so teaching students to do that, and certainly discussing kind of the issues of, now, do you agree with this source because it's reinforcing what you believe yourself? That certainly is important. And also the control of these platforms. So as we were discussing with Elon Musk and Twitter and how Twitter has now become X, which now is kind of just a platform for these far-right voices.
We were talking about this earlier.
Yes, we were talking about it earlier before the podcast.
Off air.
But my point is that, now you have this incredible, powerful source where you have people who are just sharing information with one another that is supporting their own views. And, the memes on X are pretty amazing. So, yeah. That's all I have to say about that.
We could talk a lot more about this, probably.
Let me ask you this. You talked a little bit earlier about your students' ability to read images, maybe even better than they can read texts.
Yes.
How are some of your multimodal projects going in class? How are students, one, responding to them, maybe in terms of their attitude? Hey, I like this more than maybe I would a traditional, writing assignment. And two, how do you judge their abilities to successfully complete those projects?
Right. That's a great question. To answer the first question, my students are very engaged with multimodal projects, and that's really because, that's how they're consuming content and information. And so even in my 2010 class, where I assigned them a textual analysis essay, and they had to find an op-ed from the New York Times, the Salt Lake Tribune, and the Deseret News, and then, do a textual analysis of the op-ed. I had several students select op-ed articles from the New York Times that were mostly photographs or were a blend of video, text, and other kinds of visual content. And I think it's because they felt more comfortable kind of processing and analyzing that and kind of consuming that content than simply reading something. So engagement is not an issue when it comes to bringing in multimodal projects. I think the biggest challenge has been understanding the lack of digital literacy skills that students possess. So recognizing that students don't really know how to use technology as a tool because, or even recognizing maybe this is how they are communicating or creating content, but like having that metacognition to help them understand their own thinking and process, that's been difficult to kind of help them identify and recognize. And so a great example is initially in my 1010, I had them use WordPress to create this blog where they were going to analyze visuals. And it was difficult for the majority of the students to click the publish button because they're used to platforms that just constantly save everything that they're working on. Whereas with WordPress, which has a bit more of an old school interface, you have to click the save button after everything that you do. So in my 2010 class, I had them do a similar assignment where they had to find 5 visuals from social media and break down the rhetorical situation for each one. And I had them do a Microsoft Sway board because it saves automatically, so they didn't have to click the save button or the publish button. And that was far easier for students to produce that assignment how I envisioned or how I wanted them to. So that's been difficult for me, especially as a new instructor, to navigate, the amount of scaffolding that's needed, the skills I need to teach my students first before they can successfully engage in creating these projects. And Dr. McMurrin has a great metaphor. I was discussing this with her, and she said, it's kind of like someone having a piano, growing up with a piano in their house, and you think, oh, well, surely you can play the piano because you grew up with one in your house. I grew up with a piano in my house, and I can only play one song. So it's kind of a similar thing where I assumed that because students grew up in the digital age and, had a tablet or a phone in their hands since they were children, then they would easily be able to translate those skills into using it as a critical tool. But that's been a learning curve. But it really is just a process of trial and error. And I feel next semester, my 2010 class, I'm actually teaching on the theme of visual and digital culture. And so I feel much more confident in knowing what skills I need to provide students and the level of scaffolding that I need to provide so that they can be successful in really achieving these projects, and also, learning how to develop frameworks independently that will help them process all of the visual saturation that they experience outside of the classroom. So.
Yeah, that is a challenge, and we think about that all the time as composition instructors. That what are the assignments that are going to best meet the needs of these students, and critical thinking that you're talking about, saying have to scaffold that and put that in there, is obviously one of the things that we want them to develop in our composition classes.
Exactly.
In whatever way of expressing that we end up having them do. And maybe it comes down to the fact that we have to let go a little bit and say, writing a textual response, and even the next phrase I was about to say is so wrapped up in this. I said writing a textual response on a piece of paper,
right.
Which not every a lot of students go through college without ever writing anything on a piece of paper,
right?
But having them write, textual critical thinking response to a textual object is just one of the things that we're going to do. It's not the default anymore, maybe, is the way we have to think of that.
Right.
When you go into a writing class, that, all the years that I was a student, all the years that I was a graduate instructor, in early years of being a professor, that's what you did. And maybe, and I've done this one for a long time, analyze a Super Bowl commercial, done that for a long time. But that would maybe be the only kind of foray out of read a text, respond in writing to a text in the ways that are standard. And so maybe we just need to think of that as one response, one type of assignment amongst many other possible assignments.
Right. Yeah. I also think it may be kind of a generational thing, simply in that I use, for example, if I'm reading, which I did do this with my English 1010 students, because I love Joan Didion and her great collection of essays, Slouching Towards Bethlehem. So I had them, for their profile, I had them read Where the Kissing Never Stops, which is a profile about Joan Baez, the folk singer. And I knew my students wouldn't read it, so we had, using Audible, Diane Keaton read the essay for us. We listened to it for 25 minutes. And I introduced it by saying we're going to engage in this immersive technique because, I found a study that said that by engaging visually as well as audibly heightens your comprehension. So that's how we started. And then I had a PowerPoint where I broke down authorial presence, and I was, very selective with my images and thinking about kind of my typography and how these things would, these various modes would interact with one another. And then at the end, I played them a video of Joan Baez. So I modeled multimodality for them because that's actually how I myself would engage with that text. I would read the essay and then go onto YouTube and find a video of Joan Baez. So I think that simply, I guess what I'm saying is I am more used to using these tools to help me process the text or have the text live beyond the page maybe a little bit. And that's something that I try to bring to my students, because at the end of the day, I just want them to know that, Joan Didion is a great author and a great writer, and I want to introduce them to this piece. But by having them see it as more than just a text on a page, I think maybe that might be more influential, because simply that's how they're processing content, If that kind of answers your question, or is in conversation with it, maybe.
Yeah. And again, it's going to force a lot of us to, we've been talking primarily about the the composition classroom. But when I think about the literature classroom, there are challenges there.
Sure.
I'm preparing for the first time in several years to teach a novels class again, and I often use parts of E.M. Forster's Aspects of the Novel, which is really a compilation of lectures he gave in 1927. And one of the famous lines he has is, books have to be read to know what's in them, and alas, that takes time. Mm-hmm. And, Absolutely. I just want to make sure that while we talk in these multimodal ways, mm-hmm. that we don't eventually say, you know what, our students and human beings in general, they're never going to read long things anymore. They're just not going to read, a 300-page novel. It's just too much to ask.
Right.
I don't want us to go down that road, but at the same time, I think that what you've been talking about and the way you've been talking about approaching teaching and these foundational courses like composition, mm-hmm. if we can say it's one of many things.
Yes.
And maybe at this point in time we say it's something you wouldn't normally do in the course of your life if I didn't make you pick up this 400-page book and read it.
Right.
But here are some multimodal ways of engaging with ideas that are raised by this. Here's mm-hmm. some things that we can do to enhance that process, mm-hmm. and let's experience that.
And I also think multimodal ways of responding.
Yes. Yes.
So have them read Anna Karenina and then create some kind of video essay about it, or keep some kind of visual journal about what they're reading, So I certainly, I love reading and writing. I'm more passionate about that than I am about helping students, honestly. But, these are things that I want to maintain and that need to be maintained because they're such a part of who I am, But I also think you shouldn't be afraid of multimodality because there are a lot of exciting aspects to it. And multimodality really, and the reason why I like it, and there's this great book by Jody Shipka called Towards a Composition Made Whole, and she specifically writes about how to bring multimodal projects into the first-year composition classroom. And she makes the argument that we have to do that because how else is composition going to be relevant and maintain its relevancy, as you were saying? But also it is a focus on process, So by helping students understand that reading is a process and perhaps engaging in some multimodal activities as they're reading is something that will help them get through this challenge of reading a 400-page book or something like that. That's something positive about multimodality to me, is that it is so focused on process, on the reading process, the research process. My favorite part of being a writer and a scholar is the exploration process and trying to, just leave my mind open to what I might come across online that relates to or, serves as a visual metaphor for what I'm reading or something like that. So it's just a different way of engaging with the text, but the text is still the central thing that, I'm anchoring myself to. So,
yeah, that's a great way of thinking about it. And I kind of promised you off air that I would bring this up too. That you did your undergraduate capstone project on Frank O'Hara.
Yes.
He was a poet who, in many ways, we were talking about, kind of predicted a lot of the things we've been talking about, this multimodal way of expressing yourself. Mm-hmm. And he wrote a famous, it got called at the time, a faux manifesto, Personism, a manifesto. Mm-hmm. But it really, and if I understand it correctly, if I'm remembering correctly, the editor of the collection he was writing it for made him write a real one. And over the years, the faux manifesto has had far more cultural relevance than the real one.
Right.
But in it, he talks about how, this creation of personism, which is what he titles it. He said, he had had lunch with Leroy Jones, and he went home. He went to his office. He was going to write a poem about someone he was in love with. And he said, if I wanted to, he realized this, and I want to get this quote correct. If I wanted to, I could also, I could use the telephone instead of writing the poem. And there was just a aghast reaction to that how could we elevate a conversation on the telephone to the same level as a poem?
Right.
And it seems like we are constantly experiencing that. That, here he is saying this in 1959 and predicting a lot of the kind of multimodal technological future that we are now experiencing.
Yes. To O'Hara, self-expression and communicating that self-expression was a revolutionary act. It was kind of a form of performance, I think. Especially, he was a queer poet. And so personism, putting himself visibly on the page, as well as though his life was important. Sometimes his poems, he would literally type them at parties. And as we were discussing, it would kind of be like a tweet or a Facebook post, oh, hey, there's Johnny, drinking or something like that. So the way that he communicated and expressed himself as though it were poetry, I think. And the influence, my project specifically was on his relationship with the abstract expressionists and how those painters like Jackson Pollock, he didn't really care if you didn't understand what he was saying, because the point is he was expressing himself, and then you would be able to look at it and kind of discern your own meaning, come up with your own meaning, So when we think about how O'Hara expressed himself honestly and how it was a revolutionary act to communicate as though he were talking on the telephone, his poetry, because it was just him communicating, and that was kind of, I think, the overall point. But also the way that O'Hara, one thing I love about his work is that he wrote a lot about movies, So the way that media played a role in how he saw himself and expressed himself, and how he, helped process, I think, what he was experiencing and going through, is very similar as well to what we're doing today. It was not, he would write about, some B movie he saw at the theater, but it led to these, really deep existential thoughts that in the end are what make him a human being.
Yeah, and that's it's just powerful. And I think as you're talking about it brings back that idea that you brought up earlier, that's the promise of technology. That's this idea that we have all this access. You were talking earlier, all this access to information, but you're saying, well, maybe it's not quite as open as we think it is.
Right.
And there's just these ways of self-expression, and we can just be ourselves. And yet, if we're just hunting likes, are we really being ourselves?
Exactly.
O'Hara seems to have had an idealized way of thinking how we can express ourselves.
Right.
And that can happen, but quite often other things happen, right? Other things interfere with that expression. So technology, for all its potential, can also lead us down maybe a path we don't want to go down.
Right. And O'Hara, as I mentioned earlier, it was a revolutionary act for him to express himself in the way that he was, because he was responding to a society that was not as open, right?
Right.
And that didn't have this level of access and that had all these expectations. His manifesto personism, a lot of people made fun of it, because they thought it was a joke, which it kind of was. But at the same time, he was personism, parts of personism really influenced and inspired the abstract expressionists, who completely changed modern art. And he at the time did not receive that recognition. But he also was not afraid of, his first collection of poetry, his poems were published side-by-side paintings by Joan Mitchell. So he was not afraid of expressing himself in different ways because that's what he was saying, right? This is how I want to express myself. This is how I want to communicate what I'm trying to say. Today, when we have this ability to overshare, I think, and we have this, people use social media as a way to perform, for likes. It's not as revolutionary, certainly, but it also, I think, because it has become the norm, it has lost its kind of sense of power or even self-respect, maybe. But, when we think of what all of these ideas, we thought Facebook is going to be great for democracy because suddenly all of these people have the ability to share their thoughts and ideas. But now that happens so rarely, And it's honestly strange. Like when October 7th happened in Israel, I started seeing all this really violent content on my social media. And while I myself am very engaged and concerned with that topic, I was kind of annoyed because, my Instagram it's like my smoke break. It's taking 5 minutes where I just decompress and I look at stupid things. And suddenly, here were all of these people sharing really important content. But I wasn't responding to it in the way that I should have been because I'm used to this app being this superficial, stupid kind of thing. So, it's the way social media has influenced our society, in my view, is very negative. And the way it's influenced students specifically, the way that we compare ourselves to one another, or it's no longer a revolutionary act to share what you're eating for dinner.
Right.
In the same way that it was for Frank O'Hara.
Right.
So.
Right. I mean, it's really, it's a cliche, right?
Right. Exactly.
The picture of the dinner and the long description of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank
you
for
joining
having
us.
Me. Yeah.
It's been a great conversation. Maybe we could put a timestamp on this one and say, okay, at about 45 minutes, they start talking about poetry instead of composition classes. So you might, if you're interested in poetry, keep listening. If not, you may want to say, okay, I like the composition stuff.
But reading Frank O'Hara, I think, can help you process the oversharing and kind of the over, that gets back to wanting my students to use literature as a tool to help them understand the age that we're living in, right? And kind of process, because today digital platforms don't provide them that space. We have to provide it for them. And I think poetry by Frank O'Hara is a great way to do that. So.
Thank you very much. This has been a great conversation. Thank you, Brett, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, all of you for listening. And we will see you on our next episode.
This has been the Being Human UT podcast with Dr. Randy Jasmine and Dr. Jim Hindigas. Please follow and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. From Utah Tech University, this is the Being Human UT podcast. This has been a production from a podcast studio.